So great that you could join us today. We would not have started without Jeremy. So that was perfect, Jer. The series is called Engaging All Learners in the Secondary Years, and our focus today is disciplinary literacy. On the next slide, you'll see a little image that will appear. And in that little image, you'll just see these are the previous sessions that we've had this year. Our first session focused on English First Peoples 10 to 12 with Denise Augustine, Emma Milliken, and Erica Fitton. Our second session focused on learning through story with Sarah Florence Davidson. And today's session is around disciplinary literacy with Heather Brown, Tammy Renyard, and Vicki Roberts, colleagues I've been so fortunate to work with over the years and who have supported me in my practice and been such great colleagues just in terms of thinking through things, trying out things together, and quite honestly, folks, sharing our fails so that we could learn from them and become better educators together. All sessions are recorded and are available on the Edith Lando website where you registered. You will also get an email in about a week or 2 weeks' time with a link to today's session if you want to rewatch some favorite parts or hear my terrible jokes. This series is a partnership between BC Teachers of English Language Arts, which is the PSA through the BCTF, the Greater Victoria School District. Tammy came to me about 4 years ago and said, "Can we do some things?" And lo and behold, we're doing some things. The Rural Education Advisory, because we believe everyone should have access to great professional development wherever we are, and the Edith Lando Virtual Learning Center. My name is Leyton Schnellert, and I'm the Eleanor Ricks Professor of Rural Teacher Education, and I'm so glad to be here with you on this tour today. I'm joining you from Syilx territory, which is colonially called Kelowna, or Kelowna, which means bear, and that is in Tsiltchin, which is the language of the Syilx. And I'm just so fortunate that it's sunny today, but more importantly, I'm so fortunate to be learning from the land, with the land, on the land, guided by elders and knowledge keepers in this place. And I'm so excited because part of disciplinary literacy is land as text when it fits within the work that you're doing. So rather than talking about me, I'm going to pass the torch now to Tammy.
Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. We would like to acknowledge that we're Zooming from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people. So this image is, I'm not sure if I'm getting it perfectly right, but Quetlal, and that is Lekwungen word for camas and Gary Oak. And I chose this with spring and April and flowers, and it's connected to the sequence that we're going to share later on. And I bring it up to share that this is the time when camas is in bloom and harvested. And you'll find out a little bit more information in the sequence later, but I was learning about this in just today and looking at some of the pieces around how it's actually cooked. And there's videos online that you can see how they cook the Quetlal in a pit cook for 24 to 48 hours. There's so many great resources, and we're going to talk about diversity of text in some of the work that we're going to do today. So just want to acknowledge the Songhees and Esquimalt nations on whose traditional territories we live and work in the Greater Victoria School District. And just the next slide will introduce our team. So this is Leyton. I think everyone knows Leyton. Leyton is like famous across the land. Heather, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Like many of you, today's the first day back from break, so just trying to get up to speed and get my brain back into work mode. But I'm really grateful and excited to be with you today. I have a background as a science teacher, physics and chemistry, as you'll see some work today, and currently also a teaching vice principal in a secondary school in Victoria.
Thank you. And Vicki Roberts.
Hello, everybody. I too am on first day back brain and skill level. It's a great place to be. So I am currently a principal in a middle school here in Victoria. Was at a secondary school for 4 years before that, at the district level for a hot second with Tammy, working with secondary folks across our district. And big areas are in literacy across the board, and doing all things to help students build their skills, their capacity, their thinking, their engagement, and their excitement in the literacy world.
Thanks, Vicki.
Mhm.
And again, my name is Tammy Renyard. I'm a district principal in Greater Victoria. I first met Leyton a long time ago when we were young, when I was a district literacy teacher in Cowichan. And so literacy has always been heart work for me. As a district principal, I still love to get into classrooms and work alongside teachers building out literacy skills. So we're really excited to be here. What we'd love from you is if you could please put into the chat, what is your teaching area? What level are you teaching at? And where are you zooming in from today? So we'll give you a minute to just jot some information about you into the chat box so we can see what folks what's their day-to-day classroom experience look like. All right, if you haven't had a chance and you still want to add, that's great. We are grateful to have you in the room. As we can see, literacy conversations often bring our humanities folks, and today we're going to stretch humanities as well as into the science and math land. So this might be sharing with colleagues as they look at that disciplinary literacy piece from today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Vicki.
Unmute. So we want to share what some of our intentions are, what we hope for you to think about, walk away with, and grab as we're here together. First and foremost, we want to understand the contextual nature of literacy, that literacy is across the board in all subject areas, but it also has some specific areas, skills, strategies, and forms within different contexts. We also want to spend some time looking at the difference between universal strategies and discipline-specific strategies within literacy. Leyton's going to talk to us about the apprenticeship and mentorship model. Just how do we lead and do this work and engage with it with our students? And also, we're going to share examples because we always want examples. What does this actually look like in our classrooms, in our schools, across our districts and sites? So we'll share what strategies and examples that you can use tomorrow, or some that are more ongoing long-term sequences. As the four of us were sitting and thinking what's critical, what's important, and what's our essential driving question as we get together and plan and think and share for you folks today, we kept coming back to this question that we pulled from a text that's one of the resources that we're talking about using and sharing, and you may have seen it. It's Disciplinary Literacy in Action. It's a very useful resource. And that essential question is, how can we shift our view of literacy teaching and learning so that it is situated as a tool within the discipline instead of an add-on? And this is critical, and we're going to keep coming back to this and back to this. The work that we're thinking of and doing and promoting learning is not meant to be something new and extra that we're doing that we've got to add on in our teaching areas. This should be ongoing, explicit, and embedded so that it's alive and rich and engaging for our students, and they can see the authenticity and meaning and purpose behind the work that they're doing and how they're learning. And the other piece is that we really want to leverage the expertise and authentic disciplinary specific connections to those subject areas. We know that oftentimes, when we're, especially in the secondary lens, when we start to get more specific and focused, that we hear the term often, we're all teachers of reading and writing. We are all in many ways literacy teachers, but lots of us in secondary, well, some of us haven't had specific training on what does it mean to teach a student to read. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, this is the opportunity to get students alive and engaged in those subject areas where they're seeing the content, the material, the skills, and the applications actually come alive beyond the four walls of their classroom or their school. And so how do we highlight those, make them explicit so students are aware of what's going on. How do we bring them in and make the learning rich? That's big hopes for us. And we wanted to share the guiding literacy definition that we have in BC. This comes right out of our curriculum. And, you know, we often think of in terms of reading and writing, speaking, which are all important connections within literacy, but literacy is a wider term that's rich. And we're looking at multiple modes, varieties, rich purposes beyond just the simple form of reading and writing. And literacy is embedded in all that we're doing. We want to provide these rich opportunities across every subject, across all areas, day to day, so that in the end, as our students are leaving us in grade 12, that they have lots of exposure, that they have seen themselves as readers and writers and thinkers in multiple subject areas, and that they're able to navigate and live a literacy-rich life outside of school. And I'm just going to share a little bit of what do we mean when we're talking about content area literacy and disciplinary literacy. These are two terms that are really umbrella terms. It's literacy across the board, and oftentimes they piggyback and they're married together in different ways. They're not exclusive of each other, but they are a little bit different. So, and these are terms that you may have heard or will hear over time. And so we wanted to put them out here and discuss them a little bit so that as we go on in the session, you'll understand what we're talking about when we're bringing up these two terms and thinking about what they mean in your day-to-day teaching and your students' learning. So you can see my left, content area literacy. These are skills and strategies that are really across any subject area. We can think about these as universal strategies. So what are strategies that students are using to access text, to engage in text, regardless of what the subject area is? These are things that we're focusing on the what, we're looking at comprehension. We might be asking clarifying questions so that we're getting students to think about what they're reading or viewing or hearing. Could be looking at different features of text, regardless if it's in science or socials or math. We're looking at the accessing text when we're talking about content area literacy. We're thinking about what are they comprehending? What are they understanding? And then also more universal strategies of how they're communicating that and writing. So it could be, let's say, if we're thinking about a student is using, doing a pre-write, they can be doing pre-write brainstorms in any subject area. It's not specific to that one discipline. They could be doing revising in any subject area. They could be doing partner talk and feedback in any subject area. So these are literacy tools that really go through the curriculum. The big goal here is that these are strategies that are helping students access text, engage, and comprehend. And really, this is where we also think about strategies that help students across the board, inclusive strategies such as chunking text, breaking down text to make it more manageable. So this is to build, it's thinking about an inclusive classroom and what are the skills and strategies that help our students get into the text, comprehend, and work with it. And then when we move over to disciplinary literacy, this is where we're starting to get more specific. We're starting to think about what are the reading, writing, thinking, communicating skills that are more specific to the specific, I'm going to say specific 100 times here, apparently, that are more, it's going to be the word of the PowerPoint of the presentation, that are unique and discrete to that discipline. So if we're considering, if we're looking at, we'll use math a lot in this example, but, if we're looking in a social studies lens, what are we doing as historians or as anthropologists, social scientists that are specific to that discipline? What types of materials are you reading? What type of text are you interpreting? What are you looking at? Maybe you're doing field notes as a piece of writing. That would be something that a social scientist or an anthropologist would be doing in that field of work. This is where we're really thinking and acting, reading, writing, thinking like a scientist, like a historian. This is, once again, I said it before, this is where the subject becomes alive. This is where we really can get students into it so that they're understanding the bigger context of what they're learning. And also, this is where we, we really build the explicitness. As we're experts in these areas, if you're an expert in math, if you're teaching math, hopefully, science, hopefully, all of the other areas, you have skills and strategies that you can bring. You have knowledge and passion and expertise that you can bring. How do you utilize those skills and make it come alive for students so that they can see it? We need to make it explicit because these become things that we do because we're just so used to it. We're used to doing the math processes, but how do we make that come true for students?
If I can
Heather,
just
again,
add,
if you want to jump in, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is where the expertise that teachers have really can shine. This is where we try to, if we go back to that essential question, really support the discipline of literacy as a tool embedded to use to bring that discipline to life. And the expertise you have of that thinking and the reading and the types of texts that we choose to engage with within a discipline comes from your deep knowledge of it. And typically we have gravitated to the things that we would love and we came to naturally. And it's really unpacking those things that we have to make it explicit for students so they can develop in those ways through the ways that we support their literacy development. So this is the first viewing of this. This is a little brainchild. We had a conversation with Leyton and there was a genuine light bulb moment of how we could conceptualize this. And I see that our BC curriculum is moved off to the lower left, but it should be on the top right. But if we look at the right side, the two green circles, we're looking at the BC curriculum and thinking about the core competencies. And then we know through the work that we've been doing as a province in the last few years around the contextualized nature of the curricular competencies. So we have our big three core competencies. And when we look at each of those through the lens of our discipline, so within social studies, we then have our curricular competencies that are the contextualized versions of those three core competencies. So what does communication look like within social studies? What does thinking look like within social studies? What does personal social development look like within social studies? That's what generated our curricular competencies. So when we were talking about this, we really understood it in a different way around content area literacy and disciplinary literacy is much the same. It's a really analogous situation where we're saying we have these generic ways to look at literacy that are neutral to our discipline, that they extend across everything universally and are important to all. But then when we actually put the lens of the specific discipline on, we can understand them in a different way. And there's subtleties and nuances within the skill that really emerges when we look at it through the context of a discipline. But Leyton, this was sort of your aha moment. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, one way to think about it, everybody, is that content area literacy is very much focused on comprehension, like getting information, like what's in here, what's the idea, what's going on. And that does involve critical thinking. So you're going to see a few strategies involved. It's kind of like, here's what's being said and here's why it's important or something like that. And so those kind of strategies you can use in any subject. And so that's content area literacy. And some of us are really familiar with that. In fact, some of us often try to talk to our colleagues and others who are teaching other things. You're like, just use this really great strategy. That's a content area literacy strategy. You can use it anywhere to help you understand something. And that connects really well to the core competencies. disciplinary literacy is directly connected to the curricular competence. In fact, the curricular competencies are the disciplinary literacy people. You're welcome. And so we just thought, what a really nice way to understand that. And of course, we do know that the core competencies and the curricular competencies overlap. Like, it's kind of good to critically think in a discipline as a scientist, and yet critically thinking is a good thing that you use across contexts. That's my 2 cents, Heather.
Thank you. It's more than 2 cents, Leyton. It's always far more than that.
36 cents.
So we wanted to take a moment and just look at some universal literacy tools, and then surface from you what some of your favorites are. So we're going to give you a few examples, and then just we have an opportunity for you to generate some that we can all keep and use together in the future. So one of the ones that is a go-to tool for me is what's important and why. And as I said, I come from the science world, but this certainly applies in all the sort of nonfiction kind of thinking. And so what's important and why, and when I started using this tool, I've been using it for, well over a decade, I would say, actually a lot longer than that, truth be told, but I bumped it up a little bit when I realized, oh, it's what's important and why to the task, to the thing I'm asking students to do with this information. But it's really just looking at what is the salient piece, and then why is that important to what we're doing? And it's not something that I'm generating for students. It is something that we're looking at a piece of text and generating together or independently. And then, 4 quadrants can be used in lots of ways. I know for English teachers, it's often thinking, feeling, help me out on the other 2.
See, feel, think.
See, feel, think, and do, I think. But yeah, for me in math, it's images, key vocabulary, connections, examples. But, these content neutral tools are just universal literacy tools. Really, they're often boxes on pages, and we just split them up in quadrants and choose the areas or the things that are most relevant at the time.
People may be familiar with this, but we wanted to share Project Zero. They just have a host of thinking tools. I think it's like Thinking Routine Toolbox. So this is an example, Connect, Extend, Challenge. They have a lot of different categories on there. So looking at core thinking, digging deeper into ideas, considering controversies, dilemmas, perspectives, so you can see how they can be universal, but when they're contextualized, may be seen as disciplinary as well. And so again, like Heather said, we just want to bring up that piece of the goal of any tool that we use for students is to have them be able to independently apply it. And so often tools can be 3 columns, 4 boxes on loose leaf. We've had students say before, well, I couldn't do it because I didn't have the sheet. And the goal is that kids will know that, hey, I can use this, what's important and why, or Connect, Extend, Challenge, whatever that tool is, independent of the teacher. And so that when they're trying to work through materials on their own, it's like, what's a tool that's going to help support me in terms of doing some of that work? And one other example is Idea Sketch Tagline. And again, a little bit hard to see here, but it's that idea of having students idea sketch. So what's an important idea that students can sketch and capture in images first, and then they can add words and other ideas. And you can see on here, it says tagline, 5 to 7 words. And that's an example of us saying to students, let's push for a summary, let's push for synthesis. So having students be able to pull key ideas, important information, sketch in words, and then summarize, synthesize is just another way to really push that deep thinking. And again, this can happen in any curricular area. So now we're going to put you to work. And I'm just going to press enter on this piece in here. So if you have a smartphone and you want to use a QR code, or we've added the link in the Google Doc, or sorry, in the chat for the Google Doc, hopefully this works. Our hope is that you will go into that Google Doc and then just identify what's one of your go-to universal tools that you use to support literacy, a little description of it and why you love it. And so if someone can give the link, Jeremy, I can see you. Are you able to see if you can get into the link? Okay, great. Thanks, Jeremy. So if folks can have a look at that, and we're just going to give you, where are we for time? We'll go 7 real minutes for folks to be able to read what others have put in there. There's multiple slides there. We didn't know how many folks we'd have today. So there's multiple slides that people can work on. Slides 3 to 8, I believe, are for activity 1. So just jot down your go-to strategies that work across different content areas. Any questions on that? Did I miss anything, team? Are we good to go? Okay, setting the timer for 7 minutes.
Thanks, everybody. I wrote in the chat box that these kind of strategies often focus on helping students comprehend and helping students respond, often by making connections or explaining something, but it's working from the text within the text. And clearly we could crowdsource all day, but we are going to have to move on, folks.
Okay, I did say 7 minutes. That's 5 minutes, 34 seconds. But if Leyton's pulling us back, you could finish your idea while we transition to the next part.
Finish your idea.
Finish your idea. Except for you, Vicki, because you are the next part. So you get to finish your idea. You actually have to present, friend. Like now, Vicki.
I did it. I love that strategy. I cannot put it in there. We ready to go? Okay. So we want to thank you for all of that. And as Leyton said, this is about really getting in and building on the comprehension and interacting with text. And like we said before, this is often these are accessible strategies as well to help all of our students get involved, get thinking, and engaging in the text, in the reading, in the viewing, whatever that is, and in the sharing and communicating. So back to our graphic, we really looked at our top 2 circles. If we're thinking about the bigger picture, where are we at universal strategies that are across the board, that are across competencies, across subject areas. And now we're going to go in a little bit deeper and a little bit more specific to think about the disciplinary literacy and what are we doing on purpose in subject areas. So there's a quote there. I invite you to read that. Just give a little second. Now we want to ask ourselves, if we're thinking through the lens of a discipline, what are we doing on purpose and explicitly within the skills and competencies and the work of that discipline or that subject area? What are we doing visibly with our students to help them understand that there are specific skills that they build on to read, write, think, communicate in that discipline? And like we said before, we know that this becomes automatic, especially as we get higher up in the higher grades. And we were talking about this last night. I've more worked with the junior area students and younger, and I was picking Heather's brain of when you get up to the senior sciences and the senior levels, so much of this is students are doing because it's what they know to do. And oftentimes it's because what they've been doing, but do they know the why? And this is where the disciplinary literacy comes alive, as I said before. We can do the things in the class and the students are doing this throughout, or because we know as expertise is in these areas that this is what happens. But if the students aren't aware that we're doing this specific skill or this representation and why you're doing it, then we want to ask ourselves, how do we help them gain that knowledge and understanding? We want to think about how do we, and like Heather was saying, that this is the chance for us in our subject areas and our passions to come alive and share that with students, help them see and know and understand that world outside of the classroom. And or how do we bring in the expertise of others in those disciplinaries to talk, folks who are working in science labs and the type of literacies that they're using in those labs, folks who are out working in the field, and what type of format of communication are they using as they're out in the field. How do we get students thinking like a mathematician, or writing like a mathematician, or communicating like a mathematician, so that they can build that skill? And sometimes at the end, if a student is choosing to go into a specific field, they will, have very discrete, unique skills. But we really want all students leaving so that they know that they can read, write, think, and communicate in any of these subject areas, that they've engaged and they see the purpose behind it. So we've once again pulled from this resource, and just so you know that this resource is shared at the end of the slides. It's got tons of ideas across the board for building, not only within your own practice, but also working in teams and with colleagues collaboratively, which is one of the aspects of the book that I quite enjoy. So at the end, they actually have a whole bunch of tables where they think specifically within the discipline. So we've pulled one here to look at this as an example. When we're thinking about students and we're thinking about mathematicians and across the board, what are we doing on purpose? What are mathematicians doing when they read, when they write, when they think? And so you can see here, you're doing different things, like when reading, you're isolating, looking for patterns, you're using symbols. It's more specific to that discipline, the unique skills you're using. And not on this graph, but something that we'll invite you to think about later, is that not only what are you doing specific, but what types of texts might you be engaging with that are different than in other areas? What type of communication are they engaging in? When they write, what are the different formats and opportunities for writing and communicating and sharing that are specific to that discipline? And also the thinking tools and skills that you use might be a little bit different. How you approach a problem and think through a problem is going to look different in math than it will in, I'll use anthropology again. These are going to be very different skills that you're using in those disciplines. And once again, the importance is bringing them alive and making them explicit. You're muted, Heather.
Thank you. This is an example of one way that you can do that to bring it alive and to put it in context for students. So this is an example that this is some work with some senior math students, and, pulled directly from the curricular competencies around communicating and representing. And so students were able to brainstorm, what does that actually look like? What does that look like and sound like in our classroom? And then we use that to set goals. I mean, we know that we have the reporting order that's changing next year, and I know in my school, we're grappling with how do we support that in all subject areas around the reflection that's required and that for students to do, and to do that in a really meaningful way that actually elevates learning. And so setting criteria together is one of those ways, and then using it to set goals and then justify why that goal is a really good one for you, and be reflecting back on why that could be. Does it capture everything that was on Vicki's list? Absolutely not, but it's about being purposeful and picking the things that we want to focus on to try to get better at. So each student was invited to pick one of these or something else around communicating and representing to be their focus for purposeful development.
Now I'm muted. Now, another way that this can look very similar, and I've done this. This is a chart right out of the classroom that was generated with my students, and we're thinking about, okay, so this year we're really going to be working on thinking and writing like a mathematician. So together, this is the nicer version. The original was extremely messy. We worked, in partnerships and in groups to start thinking about, and then we distilled it and put the criteria together to build out the anchor chart that was going to go in the class. But together we built this criteria to think, what do we have to do on purpose when you're writing in math? How does that look different? And they came up with the ideas of using evidence, explaining their thinking, that they needed to be specific and use math vocabulary. We haven't talked much about that, but one of the key areas within disciplinary literacy is that you're really focusing on using the language of that discipline, which is very different. They're using units and symbols in different formats. You're going to ask yourself, what is the best way for me to communicate this information? What is the purpose? Who is my audience? And so when you're thinking through a math lens, what would make sense to share this information, or how you've approached this problem? And so this chart became, and it doesn't have to happen in September. It doesn't need to look this simple. It can be far more complex. And it's not a September thing. It can be a tomorrow thing, as you're starting to get students to think, and it can happen in any subject area to help them and make it visible in the class.
Can I chime in for a sec?
Please.
I'm just typing in the chat box at the same time. Advocacy. Well, I'm doing my best, people. You'll know what I'm saying. One of the ways I think of this from a disciplinary literacy perspective is I look at a piece, right? So Jeremy, you've got like an advocacy piece that somebody's making. Randy, you've got a video that somebody's made, but you look at a piece from the discipline. So it's got the form. And then you say, what are the attributes of this form? What are the attributes of a blog? What are the attributes of a video? What are the attributes of an infographic? And then what do we need to do to create our own blank? And so you're thinking and you're creating criteria with that form in mind. And so you can go from this level of like thinking like Heather and Vicki have done around your competencies, right? And you can drill right in, and you can start from a form. So you can develop competencies overall. You can draw competencies from the competencies, criteria from the competencies like Heather did, right from the curriculum, or you can look at an example and say, from this example, what does it be? But we try to do that from the disciplinary perspective, like the math, science, socials. And for English teachers, that you got to drill right in, right? Thinking like a videographer, thinking like a non-governmental organizational advocate, whatever it might be. Thanks, Vicki.
Awesome. Thank you. And then, as we talked about before, Leyton said, like, disciplinary literacies is the curriculum. It is our curricular competencies. We don't have to look any further other than our expertise, our knowledge, what we're noticing in the world, but also in the planning purpose. If we're planning on purpose for this work, we can see that those verbs, those actions, the disciplinary literacies are right there embedded within the curriculum across every subject area.
Okay, we have another activity for you. Same link. I'll share it again because we've had some folks come in. Just further down in the Google Doc that you are already in. There's modern languages, socials. I'm just trying to remember which other two we picked. We just picked a couple: modern and world languages, fine arts, science, and social studies. And I know we have lots of humanities folks in the room, and I know that you are going to be able to stretch into these other areas. And our ask is similar to the example we shared in math. What does it look like for students who are reading, writing, and thinking within the discipline? And Heather or Vicki mentioned this earlier. Often we find when we're working with folks that if they've grown up and gone into work in an area that they love, that they've been naturally skilled. For example, you've always loved science, you're great at science, you become a science teacher. sometimes we find that folks aren't always able to be explicit about what those skills and competencies are. And so they don't necessarily name them for students. Students, the lesson design may have students getting better at things, but students may not know what they're getting better at. So this can be tricky as you try to really unpack what are those actual skills and competencies that students would be doing when we look at that reading, writing, thinking in the discipline. Leyton, do you want that social studies baby? Okay. So we're going to ask folks to please go into the Google Doc, and where are we for time? We'll give you about another 5 to 7 minutes or until Leyton gets antsy, and then we'll come back and we'll do the last chunk. So Jeremy, are you good? Can you give me a thumbs up? I can see you again. You're in the doc. Okay, so it's further down. There's multiple pages, 4 different areas. Choose your favorite and maybe choose a stretch.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say choose the stretch as well, or just start with the stretch, not necessarily your comfort, especially if you're working with others and going to nudge them in a new way. I'm going to share, I forgot to say, and I know you're going to talk after this, but this is where I've seen students come alive the most, and where light bulbs go on all the time in learning, when they start to understand and live the multiple reasons. And then anytime a new writing task or thinking task, they could place it more easily and have more relevance, and not the why am I doing this? They got to start understanding and answering that question for themselves authentically.
Thanks, Vicki. So folks, we'll start to bring you back. So we're going to keep this open so you can keep adding to it. And I do agree, Vicki, with what you're saying. I think oftentimes when we can be explicit about what the skills are that students are getting better at, and they know that, yes, we're working on this content so that you can build these skills, there is more connection for students and higher engagement, because they can see what it looks like outside of the classroom context to understand the skills. I've had conversations with kids where they just didn't understand the point of the content. Why am I getting better at this? I can Google it. And so it's that being explicit. Here's the skills we're working on, and we're using this content to help us build those skills. All right, Leyton, over to you.
Okay, people in the house, we could only fit so many things into the introduction before it was too many. So I'm putting it in here. Across the research, both with content literacy and disciplinary literacy, is the centrality of teacher modeling, or the lingo from what we found in research is apprenticeship. The centrality of you modeling what it looks like with like curiosity and passion and rigor. If you do it in a boring way, it sucks, people. Sorry, did I just say that on a recording? So it's really about, people, we're going to look at this thing. And you model thinking like a scientist, you model thinking like a historian, and you go in deep. So there are a couple other strategies for those who've been around a while. It's the think aloud, right? And so you actually think in front of the kids looking at a piece of text. And one of the first questions I ask, you'll hear me say this 2 more times in this webinar before you get rid of me, is what do I notice the attributes are of this piece? How is this piece set up? What are the different parts? How does it work? And then how does language work in this discipline, but in this kind? Science and I. Heather and I are science peeps. And how you read chemistry is not how you read biology, and it's not how you read physics, right? And it's people. Thank goodness we teach earth science finally. It's also not how you read earth science. And so I get into it and I'm like, how do I read this? But English teachers out there, you don't read all English pieces the same. You get into the discipline. You're like, what is this? What are the attributes? How do they work? And then I model my way through it. The other term you might have heard of before is close reading. So really getting in there and working with the text in front of the students. The thing that we have to accept is, and maybe engage in more, is making mistakes in front of kids. Is it this or is it that? Could it be this? And then they're like, Mr. Schnellert, or Schnelly, they call me in secondary. Schnelly, you've got to be kidding. That's totally not what this is talking about. But when you engage with students with a strategy in a piece of text and you apprentice them that skill with passion and curiosity and interest, they get into being that role with you. And that's central to this idea of disciplinary literacy, is getting into an authentic piece of text and making sense of it and working it. And Jeremy's heading towards doing inquiry projects. I really want to model what that looks like with the different forms, and then students can choose which form they want to use. But if I don't engage with that form of text with them and figure it out and model it, we can't really expect them to go out and use it, because they're using it in a shallow way versus in a having deeper experience kind of way. So that's my sell, everybody, for disciplinary literacy. And here's what, because remember, I'm a researcher. You might not think of me that way, friends. Research in this area is now about 50 years in. And what we have seen is that teachers who model this and engage with students, telling them, you are scientists, you are all scientists, you are writers, people, you are content creators, that students develop a perception that, yes, I can do this, and yes, I will try, versus I'm not even going to try because this is just for people who are going to specialize this in university. I explain that this is part of real life. Okay, that's all the minutes I have. I hope I sold apprenticeship. Oh, wait, it's my slide next. Ha, ha, ha. Here's a lovely little slide, everyone, in terms of what are different forms of text that you can work with and engage with. And so I want to do that think aloud that Heather and Vicki were talking about, with a specific kind of text, and really unpack what is a poem and how does it work? What's a research proposal and how does it work? What's an abstract? You want to decrease your marking, everybody? Have kids write abstracts. Deep, tight synthesis of the good stuff. That's about taking the information and thinking that way. And one of the skills that we use in the world is you read something and you got to summarize it for others, because nobody else wants to read the whole thing. So you got to say what's really important here and set up and explain it. But I do that in music, I do that in English, but I don't try to do it generically. It's not like all the different forms in English are the same. We get into that genre or that form and we use it. And we also have to make sure that thinking like a historian is critical, but so is thinking like a sociologist, which is not like thinking like a historian. And thinking like a geographer is also not the same. So we got to get in there and read a map like a cartographer. Right? We can't just get in there and say, what's the significance here? We also have to say, what are the landforms here? How do they work together? We start from the geography and then we apply things. I hope you enjoy this slide. You're welcome. This slide, everybody, is content literacy. Content literacy is things that you can use for writing to learn across the curriculum. So you can weave these in. And I saw lots of these actually as in examples in the chart that we made, but these are things that you can weave in to see what sense kids are making, that you use these ones cross-curricularly. The last one I was engaging with was get into a form, explore that form, figure out what the deal is, and then take the learning you're doing and use that form to share something. And one more we got. I'm not going to belabor this one, but I just want to talk about now this idea that we start out with an actual task that happens in the discipline. And then we think about what are ways that we can show that, right? What are the forms that we can show that? And then we teach the skills to use it. That's your content area literacy. And then we really think about how I can teach that or apprentice it in terms of what you're doing. Look at that, English language arts peeps. You even got your own column. You're welcome. But friends, rather than taking a generic graphic organizer from some other book, I'd rather make a graphic organizer that makes the kind of text that I'm using. Does that make sense? Get the students into it that's specific to that versus like I photocopied something. I'd rather not photocopy it, have kids fold the piece of paper, I mac it out on the board and I'm like, here are the attributes. Let's figure out how they work. Not my turn anymore. Thank you.
Thanks, Leyton. Thanks for amping up the energy too. So we wanted to give a couple of examples of just the slight tweaks we can make to increase the disciplinary literacy pieces. The one on the left, and I'm sorry if I'm torturing all the social studies, humanities teachers out there. I don't mean to with the science and math, but I know that often we don't get to see these when we're talking about literacy, because sometimes we don't see ourselves as Vicki was talking about as supporting literacy, but we do, because it's so specific in the way that we think and read and write and express ourselves in those domains. So the one on the left is really just taking a really simple question and expanding it and say, like, how are you looking at this, and explain how you're using the tools of science, the periodic table, to come to this conclusion. The same on the right, same thing as trying to say, okay, what do we see? That we have this beautiful thing called the periodic table. Let's go into the details of how that was created and what are the patterns, because it's rife with patterns. That's the foundation of chemistry. And so really just trying to pull those things out and make it really explicit to have students articulate what it is that they're seeing. And then this one might make your head blow up a little bit, but this is a student sample of trying to map out how they conceptualized something. So this is one of those examples of an overlap between a content area and a tool that we can all use in any place, which is a concept map, but how it became a disciplinary tool is really that, you know, you can see how there's so much symbolic representation, there's numeric representation, there's you know, the justification of ideas between the concepts by the arrows. There's using all of the pieces that are really specific to physics in a way that's in a tool that can be used anywhere. And, you know, for science people in particular, there's a lot of writing. Scientists do a lot of writing and thinking. And so really when we're working with students to talk about, you know, we write in passive voice. It makes all the English teachers cringe around me, but we write in passive voice because we want to depersonalize. And we do that because we want to say our work is replicable by anybody. And so we take ourselves out of the picture. And so working on that structure of writing, but also the iterative nature, like the blue parts aren't hyperlinks. They are just showing the changes that students have made with each other. And so really just talking about, like, as scientists, we write a lot, and having to do, like Leyton said, the abstract, getting to that, how do you situate a technique in this case, or a specific tool in a lab context? Why is this tool important? Yeah, I can go on and on about things like that, but that's the piece where when it's your disciplinary area, you really get passionate about what those specific things are.
Can I just jump in for 1 second, Heather, because you said something the other day in our planning that has stuck with me, and that when you're doing lab reports or whatnot, you don't necessarily have to be focusing in and building a skill in all of the areas of the lab report. Like maybe you're going deep on one. Can you just share that?
Yeah, I don't actually, I don't do full lab reports. I maybe do 1 or 2 of the year. We really start with focusing on one aspect of it and really get solid in that, because you have to do the other pieces, but really develop one thing at a time. 1, it makes my marking manageable, but 2, it actually allows for the purposeful development of something. So when we're really solid with one, then we go on to another section of it, knowing that they're going to still continue to practice that and we'll revise it, but we're adding, because when we think about that iterative process, we want to get better at something over time. That is the primary place, because in the science curriculum, it is the scientific method. Our curricular competencies are the scientific method. So really just focusing on developing one thing with great purpose before adding something else.
Okay, we wanted to share a couple of unit examples, so we're not going to spend a lot of time, and we're happy to share the write-up for this. So this particular unit was on the Garry Oak ecosystem, which I shared at the beginning with the Camus, and the reason we chose this, when this collaborative learning happened, I was actually at the school that Heather's at, and there was not far from the school, Knockin Hill, which actually has Garry Oak ecosystem there, and you can see on this slide that it's the most endangered ecosystem in Canada. And so as a team, when we're looking at collaborating, we felt that this was an important topic for us to pick up. So Heather, if you can just flip to the next slide, just a sample of how this particular unit was science, socials, English. Again, when we look at the literacy connection, you can see the literacy within the curricular competencies, as we've already said. I've pulled a couple of examples where this could fit. Obviously, it could fit in many different ways, but this is some of the ways that we were interrogating kind of texts and looking at how we could solve. I'll show you the next slide that shows the tasks. So we had students really looking at in role of a community stakeholder, and we'll talk about how that becomes the disciplinary part, justify the significance of the Garry Oak ecosystem. So knowing that the ecosystem is diminishing and that the majority of what's left is on the South Island, how do we protect and support it? And then the second task that we wanted to have students engage in was the eradicating invasive species at Knockin Hill. We wanted them to go out and do some work in community to really kind of get that hands-on understanding of what's happening. So when you look at the text set that we used, and again, I'm not going to go into all of the parts of this, but there were so many ways that we could pull text forward. And as Leyton said earlier, the land is a text form. So being out in nature and at Knockin Hill was our text. That was one of our text pieces, and there's a picture there. We were using maps, and we were using maps over time to look at where was the ecosystem thriving and then when, what's happening now. We wanted to include authentic Indigenous voice in the sequence. So there's a couple of places where this happened. The Two Girls Up in Sky Country was a story. So Violet Williams' Personal Conversation 1990, then shared with us by Nancy Turner. So that's an example of using a story. We were using news articles. Cheryl Bryce, that's a video clip that's featured there. She's a researcher, very involved with Camas and protecting and saving Camas. We had people come and be text. We had someone from the Knockin Hill Society. We had someone from the museum. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we were using text. And if we go to the next one, Heather, I'm just going to share. So this was, can you maybe flip? I want to show the next one and then come back to this one, Heather. When we were looking at developing this learning opportunity in this unit, there were universal literacy tools that were not specific to the discipline. So we were looking at text features to support comprehension because we were interacting with maps and graphs and real estate listings because we were looking to see in terms of the text, somebody might want to be a developer. We were using gossip as a strategy. If folks aren't familiar with that, we can send you the link, and it's go out and selectively seek important points. Again, can be used in any context. What's important and why? Or is using responding frames. My partner's blank and I believe blank because. So focusing on justification because that was a skill we were working on. So all of these tools were built throughout this unit, but where it switched to that disciplinary literacy was when students went into the role that they chose to select their task. Because when we look at voice and agency and having students pick up the work, there's that opportunity to personalize. So we wanted students to be able to think and write like a scientist or a politician or a realtor or a botanist or historian so that they had some voice and choice over what that demonstration of learning was going to be after we had built a whole bunch of learning opportunities together where we examined the information. And so students we had Garry Oak Survivor, and we had a rezoning activity where students were prepping a city councilor on how they should vote on a rezoning application. So every single thing we did in this unit was building to that place where students could take on the voice of one person in the community. And if you go back one, Heather, I have them in the wrong order. That's a T-chart that we had where we looked at co-creating with students. What's the criteria that we need to consider? So sophisticated vocabulary. So that's come up. I think Heather mentioned vocabulary or Vicki. So again, word choice matters depending on which role you're writing from. If you're writing from a realtor, you might not be using the same language as if you're writing as a botanist. And so what does that mean? And we would unpack that language with students. And then things like a thesis statement, which didn't matter what format they were using because they could use any format. It could be a magazine article, a podcast, whatever they wanted, but how were they opening up? What was their statement? And so these are just some examples that we went through in terms of co-creating and building that out with students. But again, where that switch to disciplinary literacy really came to life was in the personalization and the role that they chose to demonstrate their learning. And I think that's it for me on that one. But again, we've written it out and I'm happy to share that. We can give it to the team when the video link comes out. That sequence can come out as well. Over to you, Heather.
Thank you. I'll be brief with this one, but just when, in an equilibrium context, it's a very similar thing to what Tammy was saying. It's trying to take our students outside of the classroom, outside of just the actions of computation, if it's in math or physics, or just reading text in the room, and have them thinking beyond that. And so that really comes from the task. And in this case, I had students enroll as engineers. They were designing a bridge, and in the physics world, it's about creating prototypes and that iterative design process where things are going to go wrong, and you're going to have a theoretical design, and then you're going to build it and it's not going to go the way you want, and then having modifications, but then ultimately having to prepare something for a client in writing. And so that's the nature of what this one is. And we went through criteria, much like Tammy. What is it we're trying to do? What's the criteria? What's that going to look like? What's that going to sound like? And we co-create that with students. And then there's the background piece, because of course, to be able to do that, there's a lot of learning that you have to do. And as Tammy said, we are layering that thinking in to be able to achieve that task. But much like Tammy's last sample and Leyton's work, we look at it through connect, process, and transform. And that connect, we're thoughtful about what text we choose. And so for me, it's often something physical that students can see, or some kind of demonstration, because I can tie it so clearly to something they've experienced in their life. But it can be something as simple as images that they're starting just theoretically. What does this look like? What is a situation in life that would represent this concept? And then getting them to use, in this case, it's partway through, they have quite a bit of skill looking at creating free body diagrams from this and getting a sense of what's happening. So I often use images as the first set, because we want that expanded definition of text to live in our work, that it's more than just problems or pieces of printed text. But that said, we're moving fairly quickly, and so sometimes I will just take a paragraph from a textbook, and I want them to know how to use their really expensive books that they're going to buy in university. I want them to crack the cover and know how to do that with purpose. And so for me, it's almost always the same in terms of what my processing will look like. Really divergent pieces of text processed with something. So I could tell them the most salient pieces from this topic, but I want them to actually to digest that and do that cognitive chewing on their own, or with support. And again, it's in line with how you're thinking within the discipline, because we're going to work with print text, we're going to work with mathematical symbols, and then we're going to interact in a group, that because we have to interact and negotiate how we're thinking together. So I'm a big proponent of doing whiteboarding, though that's not a picture of my class, but it would be quite common to see them doing something like that. And then the transformations is another example of that disciplinary piece, of where you're actually trying to have students apply that thinking and show the development of their thinking. And so for me, it's often a physical demonstration, and have them do the analysis. What are the pieces that you need to know to be able to solve this problem? What measurements do you need to take? What calculations do you need to do? What are you still not sure of? Where's the error? Because that's the layering of thinking that we want from students. So we want to apprentice that all the way along in really simple controlled environments to be able to get to that larger task. So, when we're looking at what are the tools that we would try to put together, what are the universal tools? Well, again, building concepts with images, using text features to support comprehension. So really it's inspecting what are those diagrams on the side and why are they significant? I love idea sketch tagline, because what's happening in this piece of text, what's the most salient piece of it? What's important and why? Vertical surface work, non-permanent vertical surfaces is another tool for how we scaffold that interaction. And then in terms of the disciplinary piece, being enrolled as an engineer, developing prototypes, testing, iterating, identifying what variables you need to control, identifying what pieces you need to measure to be able to analyze. So I'm sure I'm boring you with the science talk because there aren't that many science teachers in the room, but I hope that you can see yourselves and how we're layering these two pieces together to really build engagement within the context of whatever discipline we're working with.
Thanks, Heather. That was great. The last piece we just wanted to leave you with is the Literacy 12 assessment, I think, is finally reflecting the work that folks have been doing for a really long time. And I think the traditional English 12 assessment tied to a course was very specific. And I think if folks aren't familiar with the Literacy 12 assessment, it is still kind of that last piece that our students are demonstrating on their way out the door from a provincial assessment perspective. And I think it's refreshing to see the diversity of text and the importance of all folks committing to being more explicit about the literacy within their courses and subject areas. These ones are hard to see, but if you go onto the ministry website, you can just see the diversity in text. And what I appreciate is that students do need to be able to read nonfiction. They need to understand how to interpret and read an infographic. They need to be able to look at timelines and unpack a variety of different kinds of text. And if students aren't able to do that and haven't had the skills to be able to do that, then we're not setting them up for success. And we just know that there's so many folks in the province that are focusing on literacy instruction this way, and so that our students are set up to be successful. But sometimes it's the piece of how do we share this with our non-humanities colleagues, that this is the work of literacy and that it is all of our work to support our students in having a better understanding of, how in this particular example, to what extent does a desire to explore and discover affect humans? Well, thinking like a scientist is going to help me do that work. And so I think it's just so important for us to be able to share with students the explicit skills and competencies that are required within our disciplines, so that we set students up to see that relevant, important connection to life outside of school. And I saw Leyton unmute, so I know he's got a big idea that he's ready to share. Go, Leyton.
Yes, my head's exploding, everybody. I should use that icon that we used earlier. When we think about the literacy assessment, which is really catching up to what we've been doing in BC for the last 3 decades, apparently, now that I've revealed that, working with Michelle's mom back in the day. Me as an English teacher, I can help students read the kinds of texts that are from my area. Me as a social studies teacher, I can help students read the kind of text from that area. Me as a science teacher, but just like Heather talked about, how you read a science article is so different than how you read a piece in social studies. A piece in social studies, we're looking for bias, right? We're looking for versus a piece in science is what are the facts here and do they come to a good conclusion? And so when I was part of this team that was looking at the assessment back in the day, the grade 10 one specifically, we really had conversations about, we have to have a misleading text in here. And who's going to teach people how to read that? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's not the science teacher. The science teacher is going to be like, how do we analyze this for variables and how the variables fit them together? And is this a quality piece? Versus as a social studies program, say whose bias is here? And as an English teacher, what do we say? Whose voice is missing? Right? What's absent here? And so each piece of text you read from a disciplinary perspective, and then you connect them together. And that's kind of fun, friends, because that's where the different disciplines fit in. And can I just trumpet a few of my favorite online texts that people can use? Maclean's articles are online, Canadian texts, written at a level that we can use with high school students, typically written at grade 8 level, grade 8, grade 9 level, but really great to deconstruct. I also use just their images like Heather does. Let's take the image from Maclean's. I also love Time online, and there's also Time for Kids. There's also National Geographic online and National Geographic for Kids. So those are all disciplinary pieces. And may I just say that we could really spend some time looking at an editorial versus a letter to the editor versus something from reporting and comparing those. That would be, Rana, could you imagine if we could actually have that conversation in the Coots and how it'd be like, oh, this is an opinion piece. It's not fact. It's somebody's.
Let us to the editor in the Valley Voice, Slocan Valley.
Yeah. All through the Coots, my friend. I was mentioning online pieces. So go to Maclean's magazine online and they have articles there. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Sandra. National Geographic. And then I do want to talk just ever so 1 minute-ish about, I've talked more than once about Newsela, Newsela, but I just want to point out that those pieces are really content area literacy pieces. They're not pieces written in a genre, right? So Heather, I agree. I'd rather take a paragraph from a science textbook and analyze it for how it's written than just be using Newsela, which isn't written in a form. It's written as a standard form. So those pieces are great, but we want to work with actual pieces that come from those disciplines. Okay, thanks, Tammy.
I think our last slide is just around some resources. We'll add a few before it goes out to you, but that's the book. The Disciplinary Literacy is the one that Vicki was holding up that we borrowed the examples from in math. We had a literacy leadership brief that we used. Project Zero's toolbox, thinking toolbox is also listed there, but we do have a few others that we'll add in before this comes out from UBC. Anything, Leyton, you wanted to add in terms of resources? I know you talked about Maclean's, Time, National Geographic. Did you have any other articles that you wanted to add in here?
Well, I was just going to say in terms of a resource, this one's great for disciplinary literacy. For content literacy, Doug Buell has an exceptional book called Interactive Strategies for Classroom Learning. B-U-H-E-L. Oh my gosh, there, I just put in the text box. Doug Buell, Interactive Strategies for Classroom Learning. It's a great piece. And then there's a set of books that are out there somewhere, Sandra, from back in the day. It's one like Teaching Reading in Math, Teaching Reading in Science, Teaching Reading in Social Studies. And those ones are Mary Barton, B-A-R-T-O-N, and I still find those pretty darn good. But if I left you with a message, everybody, it's that we can do this, but we have a response. There we go, Vicki. We have a responsibility to do this in whatever we're teaching, but also to connect with our colleagues so that we can talk about what we're doing differently because we do different things in different disciplines.
Hey friends, that's the end. I think this is a miracle. We have 4 minutes left. So actually, if anyone had any questions and wanted to unmute and ask a question, we actually have time for questions. So if folks, does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? And if not, we hope you have a wonderful evening and a great back to work for those who are just returning. And thanks so much for being here and supporting the collaborative conversations across the province. We are better together, and we really appreciate folks spending time. We know you're super busy, and we appreciate you being here.